say one thing, he says another, and everybody changes back again.
He died in a car crash, but that's not the part people can't explain. Because before it happened, people tried to stop him. Not vaguely, not casually. They warned him. One of those warnings, according to some accounts, came from Alec Guinness, who reportedly looked at the car and told him something chilling. That if he kept driving it, he might be dead within a week. At the time, it sounded ridiculous, almost theatrical, like something you'd laugh off and forget. He didn't forget. He just didn't listen. And that's where this story starts to shift. Because this wasn't a random trip. He didn't have to be on that road. He didn't even have to drive that car. But he chose to. A brand new Porsche, built for racing, not for highways, not for unpredictable traffic. And instead of transporting it safely, he got behind the wheel himself and drove straight into a situation he couldn't control. That alone would be enough to call it a tragic mistake. But then you start looking closer at the timing, at the decisions, at the pattern. And suddenly, it doesn't feel random anymore. Because earlier that same day, he was already pulled over for speeding. A moment where everything could have slowed down. A moment where the outcome could have changed. It didn't. He kept going. And just hours later, it was over. So the question isn't just what happened to James Dean that afternoon. The real question is why everything leading up to it felt like it was already moving in one direction. And once you start asking that, the story becomes a lot harder to ignore. By the mid-1950s, James Dean wasn't just becoming famous, he was becoming something people couldn't fully explain. On screen, especially in Rebel Without a Cause, he didn't feel like an actor performing. He felt real, quiet, but intense, controlled on the surface, but unpredictable underneath. While most Hollywood stars at the time were polished and carefully managed, Dean brought something different, something raw, something that didn't follow the rules. Audiences connected to that instantly. He became the face of rebellion. Not loud, not dramatic, but internal, like he was carrying something most people couldn't see, but could somehow feel. That image spread quickly. The misunderstood outsider, the one who didn't belong, the one who couldn't be fully understood. And that made him magnetic. But the closer people got to him, the less stable that image seemed. Those who worked with him or spent time around him often described something else. Not just intensity, but inconsistency. Not just confidence, but restlessness. There were moments where he seemed completely in control, and others where he felt distant, distracted, like his attention was somewhere else entirely. It wasn't something you could easily define, and it didn't fit the version people saw on screen, so it stayed in the background. Quiet, unspoken, easy to ignore. But that contrast matters, because it suggests that what people believed about him might not have been complete.
And if that version wasn't complete, then the decisions he made, especially in those final hours, might not have been as simple as they looked. Long before that final drive, there were patterns forming around James Dean that didn't seem dangerous at the time, but looked different when you step back. He didn't just enjoy speed, he leaned into it in a way that felt more intense than normal. Friends and people around him noticed that he didn't treat driving like a casual activity. It was something he returned to repeatedly, something that seemed to give him a kind of focus he didn't find elsewhere. It wasn't about showing off, and it wasn't careless in the obvious sense. It felt deliberate, like he was testing how far he could go, how much control he really had. That behavior didn't exist on its own. It connected with the way he lived overall. He could be calm one moment, then suddenly distant, then fully engaged again, as if his attention never settled in one place for long. Some saw it as creative energy. Others saw something less stable, something harder to predict. At the same time, his career was moving fast, faster than most people could adjust to, and with that came pressure, expectations, and a level of attention that never really turned off. For someone already drawn to intensity, that kind of environment doesn't slow things down, it amplifies them. There are accounts suggesting that driving gave him a sense of clarity, a space where everything else disappeared. No cameras, no roles, no expectations, just him and the road. But that kind of clarity comes with risk, because the faster you go, the less room you have to correct anything when it goes wrong. At the time, none of this looked like a warning. It just looked like personality, like preference, like someone living on their own terms. But when you place those patterns next to what happened later, they begin to feel less random. They begin to feel connected. And then he made a decision that brought all of it together in one place. He bought a car that matched exactly how he lived. Fast, precise, and unforgiving. And from that moment on, things didn't just continue, they escalated. When James Dean bought the Porsche 550 Spyder, it wasn't just another purchase. It felt like something that fit him too well. The car was built for racing, lightweight, extremely fast, and designed with almost no margin for error, which meant it demanded precision at all times. If you respected it, it performed, but if you pushed too far, it didn't forgive mistakes. He named it Little Bastard, and while that might sound like attitude or humor on the surface, to some people around him it felt like something more, something that reflected the way he approached things, a mix of defiance and risk that didn't always stop at the right moment. From the beginning, he didn't treat the car cautiously. He leaned into it, drove it, tested it, wanted to understand what it could do, and more importantly, what he could do with it. That level of connection wasn't unusual for someone passionate about cars, but in his case it felt more intense, more personal, like the car wasn't just a machine, it was an extension of how he moved through the world. Around this time, stories began to circulate about warnings, some direct, some indirect, all carrying the same tone of concern. One of the most widely repeated accounts involves Alec Guinness, who reportedly saw the car and told Dean that if he kept driving it, he might be dead within a week. There is no confirmed evidence that this happened exactly as described, but the fact that the story exists and continues to be repeated adds to the tension around what followed. Other reactions were quieter, friends expressing concern, people sensing that something about the situation didn't feel stable, not necessarily because of the car itself, but because of how he approached it, how he didn't seem interested in holding back. Still, nothing changed his direction. If anything, it pushed him further into it. He planned to race the car, prepared it, and then made a decision that would define everything that followed. Instead of transporting it safely to the event, he chose to drive it himself. On the surface, it seems like a small decision, but it introduced variables he couldn't control. Other drivers, unpredictable movements, narrow roads, moments where even perfect timing isn't enough. And from that point on, all the pieces were in place. The personality, the pattern, the machine, the warnings, all moving toward the same outcome. All that was left was the drive. On September 30th, 1955, the plan was simple: get to Salinas for a racing event. But within that plan, there was one decision that mattered more than anything else. James Dean chose to drive the Porsche himself instead of having it transported. He didn't have to do that. There were safer options, easier options, options that would have removed most of the risk entirely. But he didn't take them. He got behind the wheel. Riding with him was mechanic Rolf Wuthrick, someone who understood the car, someone who knew how it handled, which on paper should have made the situation more controlled, more balanced. But it didn't change the fact that the car was built for racing conditions, not for public roads filled with unknown variables. Early into the drive, something happens that feels small in the moment, but stands out later. He's pulled over for speeding. Not a dramatic incident, not an accident, just a stop, a warning, a pause. It's the kind of moment where things could have shifted, where the pace could have slowed, where the rest of the journey could have been approached differently. But that's not what happened. After the stop, he continued driving, and this is where the pattern becomes harder to ignore.
Because that moment didn't change his behavior. It didn't alter the direction of the day. It simply passed, like the earlier warnings, like the concerns from others, acknowledged but not acted on. As the drive continued, the environment became quieter, less traffic, more open road, the kind of setting that feels controlled, predictable, almost safe. But that sense of control can be misleading because it depends on everything staying exactly as it is. And the moment something changes, the margin disappears. At some point, a route decision is made. Instead of staying on a larger, more controlled highway, he takes a path that leads toward a narrower 2-lane road near Cholam. On its own, that choice doesn't seem dangerous, but it changes the entire dynamic. Oncoming traffic, limited space, fewer opportunities to react. And at that stage, everything still feels normal. No mechanical issues, no visible danger, nothing that suggests what's about to happen. Which is exactly what makes it more difficult to process, because at that moment, it still feels like he's in control. And that's the detail that matters more than it seems. As the drive continues, nothing outwardly signals danger. And that's exactly what makes it deceptive. For James Dean, the road ahead likely felt familiar, controlled, almost predictable. The car was responding the way it should, the weather was clear, visibility was good, and traffic was light. On the surface, everything was working in his favor. But situations like this depend on everything staying exactly the same. And the moment something changes, even slightly, the entire balance can collapse. Earlier, he had already been pulled over for speeding, a moment that could have reset the pace of the day, a point where things might have slowed down, but it didn't have that effect. He continued driving, and that decision carries forward into everything that follows. The road he's now on is narrower, a 2-lane highway where opposing traffic shares limited space, where reaction time becomes more important than speed itself. There's less room to adjust, less space to correct, and once a situation begins to shift, there's very little margin left to fix it. At this point, the drive feels quiet, almost uneventful, but that calm creates a false sense of stability. Because the fewer problems you see, the less prepared you are for the one that matters. Somewhere ahead, another car is moving through the same space, following its own path, driven by someone who has no awareness of what's about to happen. From both perspectives, nothing seems unusual yet. But the distance between them is closing. And at the speed Dean is traveling, that distance doesn't last long. This is where everything becomes fragile. Because control at high speed isn't about confidence, it's about timing. And timing is something you can lose in an instant. At this stage, there's still no clear sign of danger, no obvious reason to expect what's about to unfold. Which is why the next moment doesn't feel like a gradual shift. It feels sudden, unavoidable, and irreversible. At some point on that stretch of road, the situation shifts from controlled to fragile without either driver fully realizing it. For James Dean, everything still appears manageable. The car is responding, the road is clear, and there's no immediate reason to slow down. But ahead, another decision is about to intersect with his in a way neither side can fully anticipate. Donald Turnipseed, driving a Ford Tudor, approaches from the opposite direction, and like any ordinary driver on a quiet road, he prepares to make a left turn. From his perspective, it's a routine action, something done countless times without consequence. But what matters here isn't just the decision itself, it's the timing of it. Because at the speed Dean is traveling, distance collapses faster than it can be processed. What looks like enough space in one moment becomes almost nothing in the next. This is where the margin disappears. Once Turnipseed begins the turn, the situation changes instantly. What was a clear path becomes an obstacle, and the reaction window becomes extremely narrow. For Dean, there is likely a brief moment of recognition, a split second where the situation becomes clear, where the need to react is immediate.
There are accounts suggesting he tried to avoid the collision, possibly attempting to maneuver or brake at the last moment, but at that speed, even a correct reaction may not be enough. Because when timing is off by even a fraction, the outcome doesn't adjust, it locks in. From both sides, this isn't a gradual escalation. It's a sudden convergence of decisions, each made independently, each reasonable in isolation, but together creating a situation that can't be undone. And once that moment begins, there's no space left to change it. The road, the speed, the angle, everything aligns in a way that removes the possibility of recovery. And then, in a matter of seconds, the situation that felt completely under control becomes something neither driver can escape.
The collision happens fast, too fast for either side to fully process. When the Porsche meets the Ford, the impact is immediate and violent. And for James Dean, there is no time to recover, no second attempt to regain control. The car, built for speed and precision, offers almost nothing in terms of protection in a crash like this. And that design choice, which made it powerful on a track, becomes a weakness on a public road. From Donald Turnipseed's perspective, the moment is just as sudden. Reports indicate he didn't see the Porsche in time, and by the time the turn was committed, the situation had already passed the point where either driver could fully avoid it. There are accounts suggesting Dean reacted in the final seconds, possibly trying to maneuver away, but at that speed, even a correct reaction leaves almost no margin for error. The impact locks everything in place, and within seconds, what had been a normal drive becomes irreversible. Emergency responders arrive, but the outcome is already becoming clear. Dean is critically injured and pronounced dead shortly after. He was 24 years old. The news spreads quickly, and with it comes shock, not just because of who he was, but because of how suddenly it ended. But almost immediately, the focus begins to shift, not just to the crash itself, but to everything that led up to it. Because moments like this don't just raise questions about what happened, they raise questions about why it happened the way it did.
The official explanation is clear: speed, timing, and limited visibility, a combination that turned an ordinary moment into a fatal one. On paper, it makes sense. Accidents like this don't require deeper meaning. They happen when conditions align in the wrong way. But when people looked at what happened to James Dean, they didn't just focus on the crash. They looked at everything surrounding it. And that's where the story becomes harder to simplify. Even within the official version, there are gaps that don't fully close. How visible was the Porsche from Turnipseed's angle, especially given how low it sat on the road? Could a slightly different timing, a different angle, or a fraction of a second have changed the outcome? These questions don't contradict the explanation, but they keep it from feeling complete. Then there's the pattern leading up to the crash. The warnings, the decision to drive instead of transport, the earlier stop for speeding, the choice of route. None of these individually explain the outcome, but together they create a sequence that feels less random and more directional. Some observers have suggested that Dean's relationship with risk played a role, not as a conscious intention, but as a pattern of behavior that consistently pushed boundaries. There is no confirmed evidence that he was acting with any awareness that the situation would turn fatal, but when someone repeatedly moves closer to the edge, the margin for error becomes smaller each time.
And then the story takes another turn. In the years after the crash, reports began to circulate about the Porsche itself. Claims that parts from the wrecked car were reused and later involved in other accidents. Stories that suggested something about the car carried forward beyond the crash. It's important to be clear, there is no verified evidence that the car was cursed, and many of these accounts are based on anecdotal reports that have been repeated over time. But the persistence of these stories says something about how people process events like this. Because when an outcome feels too sudden, too aligned with earlier warnings, it becomes difficult to accept it as purely random. So the narrative expands from accident to pattern to possibility to speculation. And somewhere in that progression, the original event becomes something more than just what happened on that road. It becomes a question that doesn't fully resolve. Was it simply a tragic combination of speed and timing? Or was it the result of something that had been building long before that day? A sequence of decisions that gradually removed every margin for error. There is no single answer that fully explains it. And that absence of certainty is what keeps the story open. When everything is stripped down to its simplest form, what happened to James Dean can be explained in a single line. A fast car, a turn, and a collision that couldn't be undone. It's clean, direct, and easy to accept. But the more you look at the full sequence, the harder it becomes to leave it there. Because this wasn't just a moment. It was a chain of decisions, behaviors, and conditions that all aligned at the same point. The speed, the choice to drive instead of transport, the earlier warning, the route change. None of these on their own define the outcome, but together they form something that feels less like coincidence and more like momentum. Still, there are different ways to understand it. One view sees it as exactly what it appears to be, a tragic accident shaped by timing and physics, nothing more. Another suggests that the way Dean lived, the risks he accepted, the intensity he leaned into, made an outcome like this more likely over time. Not inevitable, but possible in a way that can't be ignored. And then there's the perspective that focuses less on explanation and more on meaning. The idea that something about this feels too aligned, too foreshadowed, as if the ending had been quietly forming long before it actually happened. Not as proof of anything beyond reality, but as a reflection of how difficult it is to accept that something so sudden could also be so final. In the end, none of these perspectives fully cancel each other out. They exist side by side, leaving the story open rather than resolved. And maybe that's why it still holds attention, because it doesn't give a clear answer. It leaves space for interpretation. Maybe it wasn't just about how he died. Maybe it was about how he was already living, moving closer to the edge, one decision at a time, until there was no space left to step back. And once that moment came, there was nothing left to change it. If this story feels more complex the more you think about it, that's because it doesn't settle into a single explanation. And there are more stories like this, where what we think we know is only part of the picture. If you want to explore those stories and see what's really beneath the surface, you already know what to do.